I am indeed a Chicago White Sox fan, which means I know a lot about humility. So. Although my husband knows more because he's a Tigers fan, and it's not going so well. All right, well, it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. I hope we can have sort of a fun time together this morning. I appreciate the hard work of the conference planners and the kind invitation. It's great to be able to address you all and hopefully hear from you. CPS is a really important organization to me personally. I have been a member since I was in graduate school. I found out about CPS, I believe through Bud Kelstedt, but I was part of a precursor to the Civitas program called the Crossroads program. That's many years ago. And through that, I met Bud Kelstedt and other Christian political scientists, and it was such an exciting thing to meet Christians in political science because I felt sort of like an island of one. And so Bud told me about this organization. He even, I believe, paid my first year dues, which at the time was $2. So that's a sign of his generosity. And I've been coming ever since. So it's wonderful. I figured I've made it to every one of our national conferences, save one. And that was the year I was frantically trying to finish my dissertation so that I didn't have to write my dissertation once I'd started a job. So I have been to many of these, and this is by far my favorite conference because, well, who really wants to go to APSA anyway? So, all right, so it's great to be here. My talk today is actually built on the subtitle of my book that was supposed to be here but isn't here, and if you'd like to hear the story later, we can tell you this really lovely long story about it. Approaching Politics with Humility, Grace, and Reason, Political Discourse as Christian Witness. So with that in mind, I'd like to offer you a couple examples of political discourse. Pardon while I read. Enough is enough. We're exposing America's fraud president for who he really is, evil incarnate. A good-for-nothing, bleeding liar, fake and fraud. Some ellipses here because I didn't want to include expletives on the tape. We cannot endure another 4 years or he'll completely dismantle our country, tear us to shreds, and turn America from the land of the free and the home of the brave to the land of the shackled, the home of the broken and downtrodden. So reads a fundraising email from teaparty.org. But I, of course, want to be fair to both sides, so here's another example. In the spring of 2011, when you, like me, and perhaps you, I know Brian, because he beat me in the bracket, were filling out your brackets for the NCAA tournament, trying to make your picks. I'm not sure if you caught this opportunity, but an organization called Credo Action offered its own version of bracketology. Let me give you their words. It's time to make your picks in the Credo Bracket of Evil. You can vote in our bracket to determine the most evil forces at work in American politics today. And similar to the Sweet 16, they had the Sinister 16, and it included pairings such as Dick Cheney versus Fox News, Glenn Beck versus Rush Limbaugh, Sarah Palin versus Michelle Bachmann, Big Coal versus Blackwater. You get the idea. So I offer you what I call sort of dispatches from the rhetoric wars as an example, a stark reminder of some of the more outrageous rhetoric out there. And as a reminder, this is just two of thousands of examples I could have brought. To give you a sense of where I get these from and to give you an idea if you have nothing better to do with your life and are curious about this kind of rhetoric, I set up a separate Gmail account. And I had my TA sort of just add in that email address into every political organization we could think of, right and left, and just pour all of the email in there. So it now has tens of thousands of emails, and all I have to do, it's sort of pathetic when you put in evil and you get maybe 256 immediately that come up. But it kind of helps me get a sense of what's going on, and I think it's fair to say that humility, grace, and reason are not common denominators in these kinds of messages. My subtitle, as I mentioned, my title for this talk comes from the subtitle of my new book, and it's kind of fun to me because I came up with the title with the help of some students, Honoring God in Red or Blue, and then I had this, really mundane subtitle. I'm not a good title person. And my folks at Moody Publishers came up with the subtitle, Approaching Politics with Humility, Grace, and Reason. And I thought, wow, they get what I'm doing, and I like it. And so I decided to sort of build this talk around a subtitle stolen from the marketing folks at Moody, but one that I like very much and I think is really important. So my goals for this morning are threefold. First, I'm going to share just a few musings. I've already given you some examples about the state of contemporary political discourse. Second, I'd like to offer some thoughts and challenges for how we might actually be able, as Christian political scientists, to model a different way, in a way of humility, grace, and reason. Talk about each of those just briefly in turn. And then third, I want to hear from you. My goal is not to sit here and talk at you all morning. You'll have to hear for a while, I'm sorry. But I want to hear from you about, A, what you think of what I said, but even more importantly, what are some of your thoughts about ways that we can be effective Christian witnesses and how we personally talk about politics, how we encourage others to talk about politics. How can we actually make a difference? I think there is a possibility, a real possibility here, and I'd love to hear from you. And so we've tried to sort of arrange the time where we'll have a lot of opportunity for sort of either, we can call it Q&A, but I want to think of it as more of a discussion. It's perfectly fine to have a comment without a question mark at the end. It's also fine to ask questions, but let's just, hopefully we can have a good time together. So with that in mind, let me start with my musings, a few musings anyway, about the state of contemporary political discourse. At least from my observation, and often from when I dare to go into that email, which frankly I don't go into too often because it's just really so depressing. But it seems to me that political discussions today are so often designed to upset people and to prey on fear. If you look at the goal of political campaigns, if you look at what's going on in political speeches, particularly in cable and talk radio news shows, it really seems to be that it's about, let's tear down our opponents, let's attack our opponents as much as we can, not just exaggerating the facts, but distorting the facts. And the goal is not so much presenting facts as it is entertaining the audience, capturing people's attention, eliciting those fear. And if you need to play fast and loose with the truth, well, that really doesn't matter because that's not the goal after all. I also see that there's, of course, a very boastful and arrogant tone. This is just sort of the norm. We rarely hear positive political messages. Most of the content is negative. And there are many things going on here, but one thing will happen too. If you talk to political consultants, they will tell you, when they follow the polls and these daily tracking polls, when they watch what people are saying about candidates, the only messages that seem to move voters are negative messages. So if you work for a candidate I did who wanted to stay completely positive in her campaign, her consultants gave her all kinds of trouble because positive messages don't move voters, negative messages move voters. That's a reality of how things work. We know negative messages work. It's very hard not to do something that doesn't work. So there are lots of incentives. But I would also note if negative messages work, it means we're receptive to negative messages. So it's not just the politicians sending them, but it's us as the voters who are responding to them. So this whole environment is very focused on negative messages. Think about just the ethos of, for example, cable news talk shows. If you're trying to book guests, what do? Do producers look for orators who are careful, who are reasoned, who are going to explain a multifaceted, complex conversation for you? Or are they going to look for someone who is going to offer good theater? Sparks are going to fly, some really good put-downs. They're not looking for careful, reasoned discourse. They're looking for good entertainment, and they're looking for the most outrageous people possible. One thing that frustrates me in my study of evangelicals and politics is that the spokespeople so rarely seem representative. So if you go up, you get these two people, and oh, those are the representatives, and why? And I've actually even talked to some producers about this in some of my work, and what I find is they say, well, we're looking for the most extreme positions possible because it makes for better television. And so we know we can get someone who's more reasoned, but that's not what we want. So there's just all these motives and expectation to try to get people that are not going to charitably disagree, but are going to get into that heated argument that captures people's attention. Just to give you an example here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the site politifact.com. It's one of the two major fact check websites, factcheck.org being the other. Overall, I think they do really good work. I have some quibbles here and there, but in general, they take an ad, they take an email, they take a Facebook posting, they take a political debate, and they look at the claims, and they test the claims, and then they show their work. And I like that too, so you can kind of get a sense of exactly where they came from. They have a meter called the truthometer, which measures distortion. And it goes from true, and then we have mostly true, so there's gradations, and it goes all the way to false, and then my favorite, pants on fire. It's not just false, it's liar, liar, pants on fire, which means there is just no basis. It's not just no basis in the truth, they've completely, totally made this up or distorted things so much that the only thing they can do is call them liar, liar, pants on fire. So I was looking at the list because you can sort by the pants on fire, and every significant Republican presidential contender has some pants on fire statements. President Obama has pants on fire statements. So everyone every serious contender in this presidential race has had at least some pants on fire, if you will, comments. Members of Congress, their chain emails, Facebook posts, super PACs, outside groups, talk show hosts, right, left, you name it, they're all represented here in these distortions. And not just false is bad enough. I'm not real happy with false. I'm also not happy with mostly false, but pure on, pants on fire, we've got everybody there. And so when we see these kinds of distortions, and the problem is it's not just the distortions that are there, but that so many people take them for truth. And if they pass those distortions on, and as those of us who study political socialization know, we learn so much about politics by conversations with others. And so that seemingly innocuous or just crazy email that you assume someone would delete, someone else might read, believe, maybe miss some of the details, but start passing it on in that sort of virtual game of telephone. Pretty soon we're spreading some really horrible rumors and lies, and people believe them, and people vote based on them. And that's part of what makes me quite sad. So those are just a few thoughts, just some introductory thoughts on the state of political discourse. And we can talk more about that later if you'd like. The second thing I'd like to do, and where I'd like to spend most of my time this morning, is to offer some thoughts and challenges to us as a profession for how we can model a different way. Because I do think we have such a wonderful platform, both in our classrooms, also in the opportunities that come to us as academics. There are people who are okay with not just having the extreme right and extreme left shouting matches, but actually want to talk to experts who can give reasoned analysis. And I would encourage you to be one of those people who's willing to help educate and inform. So there's so many ways that I feel like we can serve our students, we can serve our larger communities, and we can help in tiny but important ways to improve political discourse. So the subtitle of my talk today is Political Discourse as Christian Witness. And so I'd like to walk through my three subjects, humility, grace, and reason, each just briefly to give you a few of my thoughts. Again, I'd like to hear more of yours, but why I think humility, grace, and reason are three really important pieces that might help us as we try to model this different way in politics. First, we'll start with humility. When people ask me about biblical texts that I think are most useful for politics, I know in Peter's talk last night we talked a little bit about Romans 13, which of course is a very important passage. I actually skipped to a different chapter of 13, and one that's not as common for politics, but I think is really important. I like to look at 1 Corinthians 13, and in fact I look at 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. That set of chapters is a really important set of chapters. Paul's talking to a church in Corinth that is really struggling with pride, and they have lots of internal divisions, and he's trying to talk to them about what it means to live in community, and he's trying to model for them a better way of living in community. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from 1 Corinthians 13. You've heard it probably far too many times at weddings, all kinds of other settings, but as I read, think about this as a model for politics, and what might it look like if these were the attributes of our political discourse. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. How are we doing with our politics so far? Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. I should stop there and just say, when I used this in a recent magazine article, and they said, well, that's just so Pollyanna-ish. We're just not so sure about that. And I said, well, actually, I'm not claiming everyone's going to do this, but I'm claiming this is what we're called to do. And I realize it probably sounds a little bit crazy, but I also think it's really important. And so I stand by. I recognize that all of the things I just read about we don't typically see in politics, but what if we did, and what a difference we could make. But more to come, and this next passage, starting at verse 8, is also so important. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what's in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And there are so many important challenges in this passage that we could spend the whole morning talking about it. But among other things, I want us just to think about the fact that Paul's reminding us of our human frailty. He's reminding us of our finitude, that we don't have all of the answers, and we really won't have clear knowledge this side of heaven. Again, this fits, I think, really well with a lot of what Peter was talking about last night. But so many times in politics, we act as if we have the truth, not only the truth, God's truth, and we have no doubt whatsoever. It is all 100% clear. Well, my reading of Paul and my reading really throughout the scriptures is that given who we are as sinful, finite beings, we have access to the truth in Jesus Christ, but we're not going to have access to the truth in our human endeavors. And if we act like we do that, then we aren't being an effective Christian witness. It seems to me that so much political discourse really now is about knowing all, seeing all, having the right answer. But yet we're told that we can't. So there's very little room for humility in contemporary discourse, and very, very little safe space to admit mistakes or to say that you don't have all the answers. I think perhaps one thing that grieves me more than anything is how almost impossible it has become for people in public life to say they made a mistake. And if it's hard to say you make a mistake, it's even harder to change tactics when you should. I have a couple of examples from working on my book. This is in my book, one of the things I tried to do is put in these, some of you probably know this, these little text boxes where you kind of get little examples, little practical sidebar. And I'm going to tell you about the two hardest to write. So this is the second hardest to write. The second hardest one was to write is I needed an example of a politician admitting they made a mistake. And so I thought, okay, I'm sure I can find one of these. And after a couple of days of work, I did finally find one. But, you'd think you could come... Now, politicians saying, others have made a mistake, we've got lots of those. But a politician willing to publicly say, I shouldn't have done this. Although the story here I do think is kind of interesting. So I've got one, although I'm a little sad that he had to apologize for this. So Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia was elected in November, and then in December, the Senate was in session a lot longer than he expected. He also was new to the Senate. And he left before all the votes were over. I believe it was December 23rd. I'd have to look that up. It was either December 23rd or December 24th. He left and he went home. One of his daughters is divorced and shares custody of her children, and they had a family event planned where his grandchildren would be together and his daughter, and it was not on Christmas Day. It was right before Christmas, and so, kind of crazy. He went home to be with his family to celebrate Christmas together. And in so doing, he missed two key votes. He got in all kinds of trouble. Poor guy being named Joe, he was called No-Show Joe. All of these critiques. But what I love, I'm sad, I'm first sad that he even had to have this difficult choice, that he couldn't spend Christmas with his family. But he faces these critiques, and so instead of just sort of figuring out which staffer, whose fault it could be, he got on a conference call from West Virginia with a slew of reporters, and he said, and I'll give you the exact quote, he said, "Let me apologize." How often do you hear that from a candidate? And then he said, I take total blame. It was a mistake. So he was willing to say, in retrospect, I shouldn't have done what I did, but even that made news because nobody actually admits when they make a mistake. You find someone else to blame. So I was appreciative that I could find that story, but I was also discouraged that there weren't more, that it wasn't so easy to find these kinds of examples. So what about us? We need to model humility in our own discussions of politics in the same way that I would love for people in public life to do that. And so so we need to show that we don't have all the answers. I believe very strongly that we can have passionate views, that we can hold those views firmly, but they also have to be held in a way recognizing I might actually be wrong. And then we have to enter conversations willing to learn. And if we can model that, I think that's an incredibly wonderful Christian witness. The other piece of this that I think is really important too, not only in our own, can we model humility in our own behavior, but I also think it's important that we reward candidates and those in public life who make the very difficult and impolitic decision to do so as well. We don't see a lot of humility in politics because every consultant and everyone's going to say, don't do that. But to the extent that we see people genuinely modeling humility and trying to take a more humble road, if possible, I think we should reward them with that in the voting booth, as volunteers, whatever, because it's the best way we can help politicians to follow that road is to encourage them on that road and to reward that behavior. So that's a little bit about humility. Second, let's talk about grace. So thinking about grace, and then grace in politics, you have all these different ways we could think about grace, but I thought I'd just go kind of to our good old basic dictionary definition, common definition of favor or goodwill. What would it mean to extend goodwill in politics or to extend favor to one another? And then I thought, even better perhaps, let's look at some antonyms of grace. What is grace not? And here are a few. Animosity, enmity, disfavor, harshness. And again, if we think about contemporary political discourse, how often do we see favor or goodwill, kindness? How often do we see animosity, harshness, enmity? It's just so common. It's rare to find room for grace in contemporary politics, I would argue, because there's just not a space for it. There's not an expectation that I'm not going to extend grace to you and you're not going to extend grace back. It's just, bring out the guns and let's go. But I think it's important that we try to model something that's different. And I think about how often, what would we do if someone in public life offered a graceful response? What would we do if those talking heads on the TV show were actually gracious toward one another instead of screaming at one another? It goes so against our norms, but I think it's really important. Which gets me to my next example. I mentioned I made a mistake being my second hardest text box. So what was my hardest text box? And this one kind of has an interesting backstory too. So my hardest text box to rate, I was looking for an example of a politician or an activist. I was talking about this distinction between what we call easy issues and hard issues. And I was looking for someone on what we call an easy issue. This is an issue where we disagree about the end goal. And we often then turn these into dichotomous issues. So something like gun control, abortion, gay marriage. We talk about these as if there are yes or no, up or down, simple, everybody knows what their position is immediately. Of course they're much more complicated than that. Of course they're not simple dichotomous issues, but our political discourse acts like they're that way. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be good to get an example of someone talking on one of these issues who's willing to admit the complexity and willing to sort of extend grace to the other side? And ironically, I did find one example, and I had it in my original manuscript, and this was an example, some of you may even remember, it's several years old now, but when she was Senator, Hillary Clinton was speaking to a group of abortion providers in New York and was talking about how we needed to find common ground on the abortion issue. It's kind of an interesting audience as well as an interesting topic. Well, I was told that I needed to replace that text box because using an example that said something praiseworthy about Hillary Clinton would be too upsetting. So even that was a little bit frustrating. But again, that's how polarized our politics has become, that there are, and Clinton is one of those polarizing figures that people have very strong feelings about. So I understood that, and I said, fine, I'll go find another example. And so I looked, and I looked. I have we call them TAs, they're really a research assistant. I have a research assistant, and so I said, okay, Eric, Here's your job this week. Find me an example. Eric looked, and I looked, and I'm like, you know what? I just can't keep doing this. I have classes to teach. I have other things to do. I have the APC to work on. We'll get to that later. And so finally, I just said, you know what? I am abandoning this goal because I couldn't find a good example. So what I did instead is I gave an example of an activist who wasn't doing this, and how I showed a member of Congress who was trying to look for common ground and was pilloried for doing so. It wasn't the best example, but it was the best thing I could find, given that I didn't have unlimited time. But again, that search was so complicated and that there were so few examples was, I think, both disturbing but also telling. So what about us? So what do we do here? And here again, you're going to kind of get the idea, we can model graceful conversation for our students in the classroom and for broader publics in our writing. We can show people there is a way to do this. There is a way to be respectful and honoring of those with whom we disagree, extending grace to them, and I think that's really important. So what would it look like if we show our students, if we show the audiences to whom we write, that you can disagree forcefully but respectfully? We don't get a lot of that. That we can seek areas of common ground even with those that are supposed to be our quote-unquote opponents. And also, if we want to be extending grace, I believe that we can raise concerns about political views or policies with a spirit of goodwill. We don't have to automatically assume the worst motives from those on the other side, but try to enter that discussion with a sense of goodwill. I think so many of us approach our political arguments with, to quote my theologian husband, a hermeneutic of suspicion. There's that sense of, well, I just don't believe they're up to any good. And so we start thinking the worst of others, interpreting every event in the worst possible light, and that is our starting point. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of times when I think this really is quite a battle. And sometimes our worst case scenarios, our hermeneutic of suspicion, may be dead right, and that people may indeed have ill motives, and sometimes we do too. I think we need to be, introspective as well as thinking outward. But if we start with assuming the worst, there's really no way to extend grace. So we need to start with, I'm going to enter this conversation with goodwill. We may disagree, but I believe that you're entering the conversation with goodwill. We'll have this conversation. And if it falls apart, it falls apart, but we need to start assuming the best, not assuming the worst of our quote-unquote opponents. So if we enter conversations looking for the good in others and with the goal of extending grace whenever possible, again, I see this as a real opportunity for us as Christian political scientists to be a really effective Christian witness. All right, so a little bit about humility, a little bit about grace. My third point, reason. I doubt there's much I have to say to convince you that reason does not always guide our political discourse. All you have to do is just read some of the more outrageous stuff out there, particularly the viral emails that I'm not sure why, maybe, I'm sure you all get them too, but you just sort of wonder, really? Did you have to send this to me? But these things that get circulated, as well as some really ridiculous claims made in the political debates, really, really ridiculous claims made on in political ads. All of this, to me, just shows evidence of our gullibility as a public and our lack of willingness to ask simple questions. Sometimes, just at the face of it, the claims that are made are so outrageous that any use of reason would move you away from the central point. I think one of the problems is that for many of us, it seems that there's this triumph of ideology over reason. And so instead of starting with asking those questions that we would ask if someone comes from our own view, they can say pretty much whatever they like, and whatever. If someone disagrees with us, we ask all these questions. My view is that we should approach everything with reason, ask questions, try to understand, and basically use the same I need evidence for that. Explain to me why you make that claim. The same set of questions, excuse me, the same approach that we would use for someone with whom we disagree, we should use the same approach for someone with whom we naturally are sort of nodding and agreeing. think this is particularly a problem with the rise of narrowcasting. We're finding this in surveys, that as people are just more and more likely to follow news from sources that reinforce their existing beliefs. And they also are more likely to associate with people who believe what they do. And so we're surrounding ourselves and little clouds and bubbles of people who all think the same way that we do. And so there's less opportunity for discourse. And frankly, there's less opportunity for reasoned discourse because we aren't asking questions of one another. There's not that any challenge to the discourse. Cass Sunstein calls this phenomenon, I love this one, cyber balkanization. And he talks about this at some length. His findings suggest that this process of self-reinforcing, not only is he saying that people choose sources that reinforce their existing beliefs, but in so doing, this actually makes people's existing beliefs become more extreme. So the more that everything is just reinforced, the more extreme your views become. So let me give you just, I actually have 3 data points on this one. For the past few years, there's a project at Farley Dickinson University called the Public Mind Project. And they've been doing some short political knowledge polls. I actually have a few quibbles with how they do them, but the larger point still works. They ask respondents about their news sources, and then they have these open-ended current event questions that they ask. In their February poll, just as an example, the 2 news sources whose watchers fared the worst were both ideological cable networks. You can probably guess, Fox News and MSNBC. So the people who are most likely to say that they got most of their news from these ideological sources were the least likely to know what was going on. And that's in one of their surveys, they actually found that people who said they didn't follow the news at all did better, which is a little disturbing. Second example. In a 2010 Harris poll, and there are so many of these out there, 57% of Republicans and 15% of Democrats said that President Obama is a Muslim. Now, we could go into long stories about this one, but it's really quite simple from public speeches that he's given, from reading his autobiography. President Obama has a very clear Christian testimony. He defines himself as a Christian. He worships as a Christian. There's not any evidence that he's a Muslim yet. That anyone believes it is disturbing, but then there's also that it's clearly much more common among those who are not in his party. Even more jarring, perhaps, I hope this is more jarring, but here you go. 24% of Republicans in the same Harris poll and 6% of Democrats agreed that President Obama might be the Antichrist. First of all, I kind of wonder what's going on when we're wasting, you know how expensive surveys are and each question matters so much. Help us, Corwin. All right, so, and then to say, let's ask a question, is the current president the Antichrist? What do you think? So many better things we could be asking. On the other hand, it does give us, I think, a sense of how unreasonable our politics has become, that people genuinely are agreeing with that kind of statement. I'm not saying you have to think President Obama is the second coming, but I think it's fair to say that we should be respectful of our president, and it doesn't matter if I said President Obama, President Bush, President whomever, the idea that we're calling our sitting president the Antichrist is just deeply disturbing. But one more, just good, gotta have something about Congress in here. My third example, in a poll last March, there's a lot of talk about the Republicans in Congress, but not everybody knows exactly what that means, and we saw that 49% of Republicans in a national poll knew that Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, but not the Senate. 39% of independents knew that fact, and only 33% of Democrats. And these are just current examples, but you can go back in time. I was looking at some data from the Reagan era, and you sort of ask people about tax policy, and you ask people about deficit spending. One of the best ways to sort of figure out who knows sort of political knowledge is to see political ideology and recognize that people are much more likely to think better things about the policies of a president of their own party and to attribute negative things to a president of the other party. So these numbers would be true if we were talking during the Bush administration as well. So that's a little bit of examples of unreasonableness in politics. So yet again, so what can we do? It's simple, but I think it's important. If we want to have an effective Christian witness, how about this one? Let's encourage truth-telling. There's so little reason in current political discourse, but we can be, I think, on the forefront, encouraging people to tell the truth and to ask those questions and to be reasonable in their approach. One way, and this is something I think we all do in the classroom already, is we can help our students and help others in venues outside of the classroom increase their knowledge of current events. We can help them learn about political candidates. And if you have ways of doing this next thing, let me know, because we're not doing so well on this one. Show them how to research effectively and point them to useful resources. I think we need to be sort of doubling down on our efforts, because at least if maybe it's just Wheaton, but I know our students are having a lot more trouble researching well. Yes, indeed, there are sources other than Google, just in case you didn't know. So how we can show them, so when they raise a question, when someone raises something that sort of the alarm bells go off and saying, oh, that's crazy. So, where did you hear that? Let's talk about that. What does that really mean? Unpack, start asking those questions to unpack what's going on, to help others see. I did this with my poor mother, but I was visiting at home at spring break, and our neighbor was telling us about this crazy thing that happened. She sent my mom this email, and it was this email about these Muslim men on an airplane, and it was basically this drill for a terrorist attack. And I'm like, oh boy, okay, I know this is wrong, but we're gonna work on it. So I first said to my mom, well, how would you know if these businessmen were Muslim? By how they were dressed. And my mom sort of looked a little confused. And I said, what if would they be Christian men? Could they be, how would you know? I said, this sounds very suspicious to me. And so I took her to, I think we went to Snopes. And sure enough, there it was, the recent version, which looked very similar to the version from the year before, which looked very similar to the version from, I think, 2 years before. They'd even kept the same. It was an AirTran flight X, whatever, XYZ. Everything was pretty much the same, except the date that it appeared on Fox News had changed in each of the subsequent tellings. But it was very simple and very quick to show there's no basis here, and even just the basic facts don't make a lot of sense. So in ways that we can do this with our family and friends, with our students, is we can sort of help people. How do we test the truth? There are some things that we will read that will be really disturbing, and there are things that politicians do that are really disturbing. There are policies that should bother us. I'm not saying we should never be disturbed, but we need to find out what's the basis of this claim. Is this claim based in truth? Before we get all exercised and tell everybody about it. We shouldn't get all exercised and then figure out later, well, was it true or not? So we can be, I think, modeling better ways to do research and to test claims. We also, I think, can be doing a better job of modeling reasoned dialogue and charitable disagreement. I've already mentioned there's so little reasoned dialogue, and there's so little places where we can see nuanced and careful discussion, that we should do everything that we can to do that, which leads to my shameless plug. So Paul and I and 4 others are part of something called the Alternative Political Conversation that Harold High has organized. If you're curious to see more about it, there's 2 things you can do. One is you can go to www.respectfulconversation.net, and perhaps come to our panel this afternoon, although there are other really good panels too. But there will be several of us talking about the alternative political conversation, and I think it's the 3:30 slot. Harold had this vision, here's a thought, of having 6 different Christians coming from different ideological perspectives, posting short, hopefully thoughtful, you can be the judge there, essays on the web on a set of questions on a particular topic. We started in February and we go through November, and the idea is during this presidential election year, have these different Christian voices talking about a number of different issues that will be part of the conversation of the presidential election, and try to do so in a way that's respectful of one another's differences, but sort of modeling nuance. I think we're pretty good at nuance. I'm not sure how much we are at difference, but we'll be talking about that in our panel. But it's been an interesting and challenging exercise to be a part of. I actually thought it would be fairly simple to do this, and had no idea how long these postings would actually take to write, because every word seems so important, and trying to say something in 800 words it's a very interesting and focused endeavor. But I'm excited to be a part of it, and I'm excited for other things like that, where we're trying to say, this is what you see, this is how you see people talk about politics, but here's an alternative way. And there are different ways that we can all do this, and I'm not sure there's any one perfect way to model humility, grace, and reason. And there's so many other values that we could be modeling as well. But just as a reminder, as we're talking about politics, as we're teaching about politics, as we're dealing with students who are becoming increasingly cynical and perhaps dealing with their own selves who become increasingly cynical, one of the ways that we can combat that cynicism is to model a different way. And I believe that we all have that opportunity, and most importantly, we all have the gift of the Holy Spirit to help us as we seek to really be an effective witness in our politics. So those are sort of my opening thoughts. And what I'd like to do now is hear some of yours. Again, if you have questions, that's fine, but comments are great too. What do you think about ways that we can enhance and improve public conversations about politics and international affairs? What are things we can do? Or if there are things that you'd like me to clarify, I'm happy to do that as well. We have two lovely ladies with roving microphones, and I am told that we are taping this or recording this in some form or fashion. So when you have a question, if you would just wait, we can start with you, Corwin, and speak into the microphone because that's helpful for the tape.
Just curious to find out from Jeff Waltz, who I did an experiment in this regard. Jeff and a colleague of his in his department, I think it was last election, presidential election, went on the road to different churches in which they debated together in an effort to do it in a Christianly fashion, the differences in their support for the two candidates. And I don't know, I never did hear a report on how well that went and whether this was successful, but this is something that at least was an effort to try to model, and I thought it was actually an interesting and hopefully a fruitful endeavor.
Thanks, Corwin. Yeah, this was back in 2004, actually, the Bush-Kerry campaign. And yeah, my colleague Jim Berkey and I went to 20 to 25 Lutheran churches. Probably 2/3 were LCMS, or Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, so more conservative. About 1/3 ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, a little more liberal. And yeah, Jim made the case for President Bush as the Christian choice in that election, and I made the case for Bob, sorry, that's from Nebraska. He's running too, for John Kerry as the Christian choice in 2004. So I think it was effective in the sense of trying to model this kind of Christian discourse. I think for the most part, Jim and I, we didn't get at each other's throats. I think it was successful in that way. It was a good way to try and bring a sense of education to the churches, especially with those two denominations. ELCA, especially the pastors, tend to be more liberal. LCMS tends to be more conservative. So I think overall it was a success. We were disappointed in a way due to the number of churches who not only said, we don't want that in our church, but don't call us again. And also, there were outliers. I was going to hell 3 or 4 times. I'm back. But so depending upon what church you were in, there were some difficult comments. But yeah, I think overall it was a very good thing to try and hopefully model that and to demonstrate not only for tax purposes representing each issue, but also as informed Christians that hopefully we can do this in an intelligent way. So.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Black.
If you can all just say your name and your affiliation,
Okay,
that would be helpful.
Josh Bowman, Catholic University of America. I'm sympathetic to your critique. I agree that the discourse is, I don't know if there's a strong enough word, but it's miserable. But there's a, I guess when I was hearing you, Machiavelli kept coming to mind. I just see him in this room saying, I was right, I also think of Augustine with the Donatists. To go back to a question that I think you anticipated in the beginning of the conversation about moral efficacy, because the question, I don't have an answer to this, but should Christians can Christians ever ask, does this work? And this being any number of things. Or can they only ask, is this right? Is there a difference between those questions? Should we separate those questions? Is efficacy fundamental to or only secondary to morality? Or do we just need to rethink efficacy? Because the problem is that there's this challenge of let's change the discourse. Will it work? But clearly the discourse we have right now isn't working in some respects. Where does efficacy fit in a rethinking of moral discourse for Christians?
Right. And I was just looking back at my notes because I realized I had this really lovely caveat, and it somehow didn't get into this version of the talk. But I think you're right to ask these questions about efficacy, and I do have an answer. You may not like it, but my bottom line is efficacy to me is not the main goal. And what has happened in my mind is that for too many in politics, efficacy has become, or sort of winning has become the goal, and winning at any cost. And at least I'd say for those of us who bear the mantle of Christ, that at any cost is the problem. And so morality has to come into these questions. We have to think about, is this a virtuous way of pursuing or not? And you know what? What I call for, I'll tell you right now, is not a model for effective, at least in the world's term, political discourse. And it's a terrible idea if you actually want to win a political election. But I think we've spent so much time trying to win at all costs that we have forgotten the importance of the process. Winning is not the goal. Faithfulness to Christ is the goal. And we have to leave these things in his hands. And so I actually do think we're at an interesting moment, and I think we can be incredibly effective. So back to the efficacy thing. This moment, because this moment is the moment of Christian witness. Because the discourse is so coarse, and we can fill in all kinds of words to describe it, if we try to, I think a good thing, I look at the list of the fruits of the Spirit. That's a fun one. Try to live those out. And I'm not saying I do this perfectly. I'm saying that these are goals. But if we look at, here's the goal of what it means to exhibit Christian character. As we talk about politics, as we engage in politics, if we're trying to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit, we will look very different than just about everyone else. Will we win the political argument? Maybe not. But will we be effective Christian witnesses? I think we will, because we look so, wait a minute, what's that all about? He's not screaming and yelling and calling that person evil, or she seems actually to be reaching out with concern and care for her opponent. What's going on there? So I think the fact that a lot of what I talk about would be so ineffective would be a really effective way of calling attention to, this is not really about winning a political argument. This is about faithfulness, and this is what it means to me to be a faithful Christian witness. So I see this as a great opportunity to encourage people to think about the gospel, but I don't think it's a good idea at all for winning political elections, but I think we have to get that goal out of our mind. Okay, let's go to this side now. You already got there. You're ready to go.
Ken Schreiber, Catholic University of America. I guess first I had an anecdote, and then I have a question.
Oh, excellent.
It was the anecdote is you had posed the rhetorical question of how can we try to live this out more in our personal lives, and I have an example here. It involves E.J. Dion, or Dion, however you want to pronounce it. But he goes to one of our parishes in Montgomery County, Maryland, and E.J. is known to hold himself up as one of the authoritative interpreters of Vatican II. And consequently, whenever the priest at his parish, will explain something, he will immediately then go back after Mass and explain to the priest what he was misunderstanding, or what Cardinal Wuerl was misunderstanding. And the priest has cultivated a response to this, which is, "Thank you for reminding me that we all need the grace of God to overcome our pride." And every time E.J. Dion goes to him, he says that every time.
I like that anecdote a lot.
So in this way, in case the priest actually did say something without realizing it, he's admitting that. And at the same time, if E.J. is stepping over the line without realizing it, he's making him aware of that. But I had several questions, but I'll just ask one because I know other people have questions. And it seems to me that the big dispute in our contemporary political discourse, it doesn't seem to me so much about competing versions of truth or competing versions of falsehood. It seems to me that the fundamental disagreement is that there is this fundamental cleavage as to whether or not objective truth exists, right? And that there are people who believe in objective truth, and that there are people who don't think that there is objective truth to be grasped. And I'm not saying that everyone who believes that there is objective truth is necessarily right about 100% of things, because it's possible to have a mistaken judgment, things like that. But it seems to me that that's really the fundamental crux, and it's difficult if there are one of the things that we believe as Christians is that there are things that have been divinely revealed that are objectively true that we can understand. And if we're discussing with somebody that believes that there is nothing objective and there is something that is objective, then compromising with something in that context would lead you to become less true. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Help me there. You lost me that last part.
Sure. Because there is objective truth.
So those
right?
who believe in objective truth, compromise would be a problem.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Right. So like if we were debating something where there
Yeah.
is an objective truth,
Right.
but you're debating with someone who doesn't believe there is objective truth, if you were to compromise and accommodate, you would actually be becoming further away from the truth, which is what we're all called to be doing. I guess. Do you believe that this is a fundamental problem, or how would you
Right.
have any?
Yeah,
advice
I
on
think
that?
you're raising a lot of interesting points. I guess I would sort of take them in sort of different directions. But this idea of, sort of truth, does truth exist, and is there objective truth? If so, where can we find it? Versus a more sort of relativist understanding. We all have our own truths, and whatever truth is good for you is fine, and whatever truth is good for me is fine. I think there's an interesting and important cleavage that we see over that debate. So, and I think that does somewhat enter into our politics. Although a lot of what I'm talking about is just distortion and hyperbole beyond hyperbole, that you don't even have to sort of worry about sort of that whole idea of what is true. It's just, you can at least say, here are facts, and the facts are being distorted, right? So I think there's still, even in that debate over truth, it's usually over, so my theorists are going to have to help me here, but it's not so much about facts as it's about values, or sort of there's a different dimension to me about truth versus facts, and I probably have this completely wrong.
So what you're saying is that what you're talking about right now doesn't necessarily have to do with truth versus objective truth versus relativism.
Right.
Things that are more on the scope.
It's more about sort of distortion of facts and lies. Now, the compromise question, I think, though, does come in a lot when we talk about politics, and there are people who say, well, I believe in the truth, and so I can't compromise in politics. And that, I do think, that's a whole nother talk. But I think that's a really important, and it's a fundamental problem that I see in how we approach American politics. Because at its core, a separation of power systems like we have, that's a representative democracy, is based on a group of representatives coming together and bargaining and compromising and reaching a mutually agreeable, not imperfect solution. And that's our system. So if we say, this is what I have to stand on this principle, and this is where I stand, and I must have all of this or nothing, that just doesn't work very well, if at all, in a representative democracy. It looks great in an authoritarian system. I'm the authority, here's what it is. We don't need bargaining and compromise. But our system is based on bargaining and compromise. So one of the things I find when I talk with Christians about compromise is a lot of people are really saying, well, I can't compromise. I can't compromise in politics. I'd be compromising my principles. I'd be compromising my faith. I'd be compromising the truth. And I understand where that argument is coming from. But what I try to help people see is that many, not all, but many of the types of decisions that are made in contemporary American politics are one on which we make small and important bargains and compromises on a daily basis. So my view is you have to say, what's the principle at stake? And can I move toward my principle in a way that doesn't compromise that principle, but moves in the right direction? So you look at a piece of legislation and say, so here's where I am, and here's the wrong way other people are going. This is the truth, and this is what I believe is the falsity. Is this policy going to move in the direction of what I believe is true, or is it going to be moving in a direction I believe is going against the truth? And so looking at things more along sort of those lines of what direction is this going, I think helps explain Not all, but most of the kinds of decisions that are made in public life. There's some decisions, let me just finish and then please. There's some decisions where it's ultimately you have to compromise a fundamental value to vote in one way, and that to me is really simple. You don't compromise. But most of what we do in democratic government are these, sometimes we call them the half-a-loaf compromises, so that idea of moving toward a goal. And so the question is, what's the goal? And don't compromise the goal, but think about what's the best way to move toward what we believe is true.
Okay, so incrementalism then, but moving in the direction of the end goal we wish to accomplish, moving in the direction of truth.
Right, and trying to do so, or the least worst option. I mean, sometimes status quo or worse. You vote for the status quo. I mean, so even that might not be moving you in the right direction, but of your choice, which of your alternatives is closer to your truth might be a better way of saying that. I mean, that's just what, at least in my mind, that's what legislative politics is all about.
So really that's Buckley argument.
Pardon me?
Really that's Buckley argument.
It might be.
Okay.
Amy, I think that's often the case, but it's not always the case, right? So,
And it's definitely not always the case.
we wouldn't say to the doctor, well, I don't know whether to do surgery or chemo. Let's do half chemo, half surgery.
Right.
We would say we know that won't work. So I think there's a category of policy choices
Right.
where the compromise is worse than either of the alternatives. Or put another way, part of what compromising might mean is going along with the other person's policy for a season to see if that works, and if it doesn't, then we go along with my policy for a season, rather than having each get half. So it's easy when it's tax rate, should it be 28 or should it be 30? Oh,
Right.
Lord, tell us what to do. Those compromises are rather easy to discern. But
Do we invade Libya or not?
yeah,
There's not an incremental position.
Right.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it works for everything. And also, it's interesting to think about my experiences which is very limited, is in Congress. Your experiences, which is much more vast, is in the presidential realm. And I think there is a difference there between executive decisions and legislative decisions, because ultimately in the executive branch, it does really come down to, this is a decision, do we go forward or not? And it's not bargaining. There are those moments, but in the legislative, in the House, you're bargaining with 435, in the Senate, you've got 100. You don't have that single purpose. And so much of legislation is about compromise, because you're trying to gather all those minds together toward one thing. But you're right, different realms of policy give us different sets of choices. And sometimes, and going back to what you were talking about last night, sometimes not making a decision is a really important policy. Inaction is an action of sorts, because status quo has meaning. And so there's a decisiveness in staying with the status quo that's important. So yeah, it's important to think about the realm. And so I'm not saying all political decisions are based on compromise, but many are. And a lot of the times when we talk about, well, I can't compromise, it's often saying, I'm not willing to work within the system of representative democracy. And that's when I find the lack of compromise so problematic, because it just, in my mind, it goes against the fundamental principles of how our system works. And there are other times when compromise not only isn't necessary, it's not even relevant. Like you say, the example you give the surgeon, this is not about compromise. It's about making a decisive choice, and whichever choice you take is going to have significant consequences, positive and negative. Some you know, some you can't know, and you have to make that choice and have courage in that choice, because you won't have all the information, which is why politics is so complicated. Oh my.
The microphone is over here.
Okay.
Hello, I wanted to thank you very much for this refreshing talk. My name is Nina Balmaceda from Naya College. I have a comment and a question for you. On the issue of whether this works, it seems that there is a tension between the individual short-term expectation and what will be better for the country in the long term. Obviously, if I'm a candidate, I want to put my name out there, even for outrageous reasons. They will say this crazy lady, oh, I remember her. I'll vote for her because she says what she thinks, whatever. But the more the discourse gets polarized and more outrageous, then it's a lot harder for those people who eventually get elected to work together on answers. So this is definitely something that, on the realm of efficacy, will not work for the quality of democracy in the United States. Now, my question is whether you have connected your reflections with more institutional dimensions. For example, how this plays in conjunction with the winner-take-all system that actually encourages exacerbated individualism, as opposed to PR that could promote more collective efforts and incentives to make the party look more reasonable, as opposed to these solitary voices out there speaking especially to their own constituencies as opposed to bigger realms. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so that idea of proportional representation versus winner take all, yeah, that's an interesting comment. It's not something I think about terribly much because I'm such a practical. I sort of study what's going on in our system, and I look at our system, and I don't see any expectation that it's going to change to a PR system. So my view is, okay, what's going on in our system? How can we understand our system? How can we work within the framework that we have, the constitutional framework that we have? I think there are strengths and weaknesses to PR systems, and there are probably others who can speak to that much more eloquently than I can, comparativists. But one thing about a PR system is that I think is both a strength and a weakness is that with winner take all, first past the post, you're going to have two parties. It just sort of ends up that way. In our entire history, when we have multiple parties, it's just the time for one to rise and supplant the other or get consumed by one. So our system, first past the post, single member, simple plurality, all the things in our system work for two parties. A PR system would work for multiple parties. Multiple parties, I think, are good in some ways because each party then can be more focused and give sharper alternatives. One of the things that's going on in our current system, you mentioned polarization, is that we've become more polarized in the last, particularly 10 years, but 20, 30 years, if you look particularly in Congress, and then you can look at other measures too, significant party polarization that among the elites anyway, not so much the mass level, but so Republican elites are more conservative, liberal elites Democratic elites are more liberal, so we've got that polarization. Well, that polarization in our two-party system and our separation of powers system that's based on checks and balances doesn't work real well. Polarized parties would work better in a parliamentary system where you have the government all together, the prime minister and the government working together in tandem. So I don't think our current system of polarized parties works well with our constitutional system that we have. In a PR system, currently the way our parties are constructed probably would fit better under a PR system and add a few more. But I guess I'm just more that pragmatic, practical. So I sort of look at what do we have now, had it for 200 plus years, I don't see it changing. So, but you raise really important questions, and they do relate. And then your comment, just which I thought was really helpful, but just to add on to that, because I think it's so important, when our political discourse, because of that polarization, and because of and particularly the polarization, obviously primary electorates are going to be more extreme in their views than general election electorates. So we have all these promises made in primaries, and as we're seeing more and more primary challenges as well, legislative races and others. So you make your promises in the primaries, and then you try to come to the middle to win the general. And frankly, you try to come to the middle to govern. And so what I'm seeing are more and more politicians are making promises on the campaign trail that make it difficult, if not impossible, to govern. So some of these, for example, whatever you think about taxes, to sign a no tax pledge, I am not going to raise any taxes at any time under any circumstance before I enter Congress, strikes me as problematic because there may be circumstances when it's absolutely necessary. So basically I'm tying my hands and I'm saying I'm not going to do something before I even know what the options are, what the best option might be. So saying in general, I don't think we should raise taxes. I am in favor of keeping taxes as low as possible. Totally fine with that argument because that's something that you can live out. But to say, I will not do this and then enter a representative body strikes me as really complicated. And even in the presidential level, to say, I will never do this, presidential candidates don't know nearly as much as presidents do about the reality of the difficult decisions they face. And I'm sure, again, Peter can tell us so much more than I can. But the kinds of decisions that the political leaders make are difficult, they're complex, they're often lose-lose answers. It's not like there's always a simple, this is the best way to go, and this is a terrible way. well, which is my which of these least worst options should I pursue? So the more that we as voters force candidates to make those pledges on the campaign trail, I think the worse it is for all of us, and the more that, and politicians feel strong pressures to do that, and the more that they're pressured, the more likely they are to sign those pledges, and then the harder it is for us to actually govern once they win office.
Amy, I'd like to just gently take issue with, this is not a main theme of yours, but perhaps a minor theme. Question, is polarization of discourse our primary problem? And I think I'd want to answer that no. Yes, the egregious examples that you cited at the beginning of your talk, they need a reasoned reaction. But I would argue, as one who grew up in an Anabaptist tradition and whose 4 to 5 century tradition has been molded by basically committed non-participation, for whether that's legitimate or not, I would say non-participation and non-involvement in the system is the worst. I think we would be surprised if we read among the founders what sort of over-the-top reaction to one another, and vituperative and vehement display of disagreement was existing. I'm sure that would have been true during the period of the Civil War and thereafter. So it continues. Now, that's not to justify any of the nonsense, the bogus examples, and the examples of non-truth. But it seems to me our witness is and will always be resulting from the wedding of truth and charity. And sometimes, and truth must always consider how it clothes itself to be relative to people. But charity must always be reminded that it has to be wed to truth. If that makes sense.
Yes.
And sometimes that wedding is going to result in unpopularity. Sometimes that wedding is going to result in bad PR. It's going to result in us being maligned. It's going to result in us being charged with being unreasonable, fanatical. The developments coming from the administration over the last year are a good or a fair example of that. And Roman Catholics, to their credit, have taken the lead in reminding non-Roman Catholics and people of faith and people of goodwill, wait a minute, there's an incursion here of something to which we must respond and react. It doesn't mean we have to agree theologically, but that reaction on our part is going to come at a cost. And I would want to say that therefore then polarization of discourse is perhaps not the worst. It's required of us as long as we attempt to keep truth and charity wed.
Yeah, those are great comments. I particularly like that discussion of truth and charity, and that's one I've had before, and I think it's so useful because you need both for the conversation to work. And I think what's happened in a lot of our contemporary discourse is we've thrown both away. So we're not worried about being truthful, and we're also not worried about being charitable. So how can we be both truthful and charitable? And sometimes you're going to kind of err on one side or the other, but as long as you keep both in mind. When I think about polarization as a problem, I think of it primarily, although not exclusively, primarily as a problem in legislation. In legislative behavior. That if you're trying to come to reason together and you're very polarized, it's really hard to legislate in with a polarized group of people. So practically, it's just much more difficult right now for Congress to do its work because of polarization. The other issue I have with polarization is it's not just the pattern, although I find that creating institutional problems in Congress, but it's also that there's this polarization of the elites, but there's not necessarily the same pattern of polarization of the voters. So that if the voters are still more of a bell curve, slightly on the conservative side, but a bell curve, and then you have elites sort of, in sort of this, anyone help me, U-shaped curve, right? So if the elites are on two sides and most of the voters are here, what's happening is there's just significant mismatch between the choices offered to voters. The majority of voters don't have a candidate who looks anything like their views, and so they have to sort of pick between one extreme or another, where so many people are looking for a more moderate way. There just isn't one, so I think it's limiting the choices. If there was significant polarization in the voters, then it would make more sense for me for the elites to be polarized, because then it would be matching. So it's that disconnect, I'd say, that elite citizen disconnect is part of my concern. But yeah, the rhetoric is often, I guess when I say rhetoric is polarizing, I don't like when our campaign rhetoric is trying to turn someone away. But I think, like the point that you make about the whole, I assume you're talking about the HHS mandate, and that's been something I've really been following. A story that frankly has not been covered well in the news because we haven't seen a lot of coverage about the heart of the debate. And I do think your example of the way that the Catholic Church has responded, I have also been quite impressed. That's a good example of holding to a very firm position, speaking a very clear, we are not happy with this, we do not approve of this, we are going to fight this, but not doing so in a antagonistic, in a firm way, a very strong response, and using all kinds of different ways in which to wage that battle, but not doing so in a way that is disrespectful or denigrating to the executive branch of the president.